what Makhan Singh really brought is the experience from another situation where people were struggling against the same colonialist system. Because India was a different situation, but it had much more organized working class, much more organized political parties, including the communist parties. And without these kind of linkages, people in Kenya would have had to sort of read through books, and the experience would have taken much longer. Whereas the transfer of these things, not only by Makhan Singh but by others as well, that is a very important aspect. I think that needs to be studied a bit more in detail. When they talk about Asian or South Asian contribution to Africa, very often they look at businesses and how they brought, bottles of water to remote parts of the world, of the countries and so on. But I think this experience of struggles and how to fight and the experiences how other people were doing it was an extremely important issue here. And obviously the workers on the railways came from India, as it was then India, Pakistan, that region, South Asia. And they were, in fact, among the first strikes were in the year 1900 or so. So that experience of India was quite important. And while he was in India, he took part in India's freedom struggle and participated in the Indian independence celebration. And as part of that, obviously, he was detained in prison or restricted or whatever terms they like to use for 4.5 years. He also addressed 30,000 Bombay workers and strikers in March, and attended the Indian National Congress as an African delegate. So arrested in India, no charges were brought, detained. There he again came into contact with communist, socialist and other revolutionary leaders. Again, this exchange of ideas, and I think they say for colonized people or even in the United States today, the best universities are the prisons, where people sort of learn more than they do in the normal universities. If you come to our university here, they won't teach you how to fight capitalism, I think, unless I'm mistaken somewhere. There might be some little course of trade union activism there, but I don't know. So best thing is to go to prison if you want to learn the reality of life. 1941, again, using hunger strike with 160 other detainees, and that was for prison conditions, and they improved the conditions. Although he was released in 1942, he was restricted until January 45. So he was still considered too dangerous to be left loose in India. On his release at 45 to 47, he sub-edited Jang-e-Azadi. Jang is a struggle or war, I guess, and Azadi is freedom, yeah? So he was sort of sub-editing that. So he was getting his experience, but also getting his politics into practice, as it were. And then he left for Kenya in August 47. Again, he didn't come and sort of take it easy and say, now I'm home, I can relax, because it was possible in Kenya to sort of to live very cheaply and have cheap slave labor almost, and in semi-retired, which lots of other people might have done. His struggle was, in fact, within the working class, but also he did not ignore the South Asian communities. 1947, I mean, while the colonialists had set up this three-tiered society of whites, Asians, and Africans, among the South Asian people there was still a lot of racism towards Africans. And they were still looking down upon a lot of African culture and so on. And what Makhan Singh was trying to say is suggest that there's for unity among ourselves, first of all, because there was all sorts of different areas and regions and classes and castes and things fighting each other. So he was talking in terms of unity, but also unity with Africans for democratic advance, so that there would be equality amongst all, to establish a democratic government with equal franchise and adult suffrage, so that equal rights for everybody, not in any sort of a patronizing way for that somebody should be superior to the others. And he says our key task is to organize joint fronts of Indian associations, African political unions, Pakistani organizations, trade unions of all workers and youth. So bringing people together, because if he was trying to sort of look at who the main enemy was. And to defeat them, they needed this unity. And he was talking in 1947 about common high schools. In Britain also, we don't have common high schools anymore. We used to have once upon a time, but half the schools here are run by Hindus and Muslims and Jews and I don't know who else. So perhaps we need a Makhan Singh here also now. And he says, learn the language of the people, Kiswahili. Teach best of your culture and learn the best from African culture, recognizing that every community had a contribution to make, and the key thing is to learn from each other. A broad period, 47 to 50, looking at organizers of the Kenya Youth Conferences, again looking at young people who I think in many ways a new generation of young people would bring about change in the society, whereas the older ones may be too settled and established and difficult to move. Took part in East African Indian National Congress and a leading campaigner for local elections. 1949 organized East African Trade Union Congress, which was a major development. The president was Fred Kubai. I think he has written quite a bit about Makhan Singh as well. Secretary General Makhan Singh. And 1949, if you look back at it, it's again a race and class divided society where among many South Asian communities, Africans were seen more as domestic workers and ayahs and stuff like that. And sort of start thinking in terms of working with other people, recognizing and respecting their views and working with them, I think it was quite an advanced sort of thing. And he was the first person in East Africa to call for complete independence for East Africa. In 1950, the leaders of the leaders of the political parties had not made that call by then. In fact, he embarrassed some of those key leaders that for them the vision wasn't of independence at that time. They were fighting for all sorts of crazy things. But here was somebody asking for independence, and this was around the time Mau was developing, which again then took that independence movement much faster forward. Just one quote from him. I think this is in the context of in 1950 the colonial government was making Nairobi a city, and the union was sort of trying to sort of look at what that city means and who was the city for. And so there are two Nairobis and so on. Celebration will be justified when this country's government becomes truly democratic, with the workers fully sharing the tasks of government. So again, that same message. Don't just celebrate it because Nairobi, I mean, you remember we had this city of Nairobi, little sweets and things, the rocks with city emblem on it. And it was a great thing for us kids that, oh, Nairobi is becoming a city. Never knew what it meant. It was just a thing to celebrate and not go to school, I think. But here, he's taking a political stand about what is the city for. And unfortunately, Nairobi has the largest slum in Africa today. So what Makhan Singh was fighting for hasn't changed that much. And this is an accusation against Makhan Singh. The accusation was that he published articles in the press, which is a crime. He disseminated pamphlets and repeatedly addressed African audiences. This is not allowed again. He told them the HM government was a foreign power, which was a true case, but obviously they didn't want to recognize it, who had no right to rule in Kenya, that Kenyan government had introduced slavery, and that secret plans were being hatched to take over African lands. Part of this was expanding the boundaries of Nairobi and take over the land and give Lord Delameres and all those white settlers millions of acres of land, which they still hold, unfortunately. So the struggle started in those days. May Day 1950, we don't have May Days in Britain anymore, unfortunately. Thatcher or somebody got rid of it, and Labour is too timid to bring it back, to recognize that there is such a thing as Labour movement and a Labour Day all over the world. I think that Britain is probably the only country in the world which doesn't celebrate May Day on May Day. They have a holiday on 5th or something, but that's meaningless. Anyway, on May Day 1950, Makhan Singh said, workers and the people of East Africa should further strengthen the unity, become more resolute, and thus speed up the movement of freedom of all workers and people of East Africa. The vision is not just Kenya, it is East Africa. And later on we'll see Africa as a whole. And on 15th, 2 weeks after that statement, Makhan Singh and Fred Kubai were arrested. And by that time, the trade union movement was quite strong, and immediately workers went on strike. And among the demands, the release of the arrested leaders, but it wasn't a personalized kind of thing only. They wanted complete independence for East Africa and a minimum wage of 100 shillings per month from the then 40 shillings. So political and economic issues were all linked together, but their leaders were important as well. But that was too much for the government. The allegations against him were that against Makhan Singh were in connection with his trade union activities as Secretary General of the TUC, expression of political views in course of national struggle for freedom, and being a communist. It was a crime in those days. There probably still is. In Britain too, maybe. 5th June 1950, restriction order restricted for 11 years, 11 and a half probably. And this was the largest number of years that anybody in Kenya has been restricted, more than Kenyatta, more than anybody else. And you wonder, what had he done that he was considered so dangerous? Obviously, he was a danger to not only to the government, of the colonial government, but vested interests as well, because of his clear politics. And I think we'll look at it slightly a little later. And the time when he was there, there was pressure on him to leave Kenya or to change his attitudes. And obviously he would not stick for it. So he stood out 11 years. And this is his home. I mean, everybody knows where Mandela was for so many years. And this is Makhan Singh's home in Marala when he was in detention. Maybe it should be a national museum, national something, but I don't know if Kenya thinks of it like that. Anyway, comes out. He was unconditionally released because he refused to compromise, 1961. By 1960, the whole episode of Mau Mau had taken place. People had been actually decided that fighting and begging for independence was no good. They took up arms, fought in the forest, fought in the cities, fought everywhere, and Mau Mau had sort of taken over control of lots of things. But obviously, the British might was, it was what USA is today in terms of the whole world's power is behind it. But anyway, they decided, they worked out that they could not control this country. The independence had to come. Obviously, they worked out what kind of independence, but the independence was inevitable. Makhan Singh comes out in 61. Next month, he is resuming his political activities and his trade union activities. No rest for him. And resumed membership of the Printing and Kindred Trade Workers Union, of which he was one of the founder members, which he did not look at. Again, elected chair of Legislative Committee of Kenya Federation of Labour and so on, involved in lots of other things as well. 62 joined Kenya African National Union because then it could officially invite membership from all races and classes and so on. There's one little bit about him going on hunger strike, which is again when he was in detention. He says he was on strike, and this is his own words. He was on hunger strike for 3 times. The first 2 strikes were not allowed to reach the public, but the authorities could not prevent the people from learning about my 3rd hunger strike, which commenced and ended for 21 days. So in prison, he wasn't just enjoying life; it was still that struggle continued. And obviously, at the time of independence, now he's sort of talking about, we look forward to building up a strong, democratic, African socialist Kenya, East Africa and ultimately Africa. So it's not just an independent Africa or independent Kenya or East Africa, it is a socialist Kenya. That was his vision. So again, the class issues were quite prominent in his mind. I'm not looking at the time, but I'll just try to finish it quickly. This is somebody writing about the time he died in May 18, 1973. He dies peacefully and so on. And again, this person mentions his widow, his 3 children, and Dr. Indrajit is with us today, which is quite a sort of a nice occasion for us. I won't go too much into this, but there's millions of things people have said about him, and I just pick up 1 or 2 things. His sacrifice in support of Kenya's freedom struggle and his leadership in bettering conditions of Kenya's lowest paid workers have made him the most important Asian to have lived in East Africa. I would say not Asian, but the most important Kenyan, really, because I don't see anybody else having done that. Gugivat Nyong'o says his book, I was waiting for this to come. This is the book, which is out of print, not available, and it's a fantastic resource. It's in 2 volumes, and part of the work he did was it's a meticulous record of the trade union struggles right from the year of 1900. The first strikes mentioned here are in 1900 or thereabouts. So it's anybody who wants to study history of colonialism or anti-colonialism, not only Kenya but Africa or maybe the world over, must read this book. But I won't lend it to you. Fred Kubai talks about his honesty for working class. I know him as a fighter, every inch a fighter, a Kenyan nationalist of the highest order and a brother in trade unionism in our national struggle. So, he will remain a legend. He will be remembered for his untold sacrifices and so on. When he could provide his family with little but pride and values, we will hear that side of his life a bit later. As father of the trade union movement, unionism for a long time remained the only avenue and so on. It was Sardar Makhan Singh who declared Uhuru Sasa, independence now. I don't think I'm going to go on. Yeah, this last bit is in the process. He not only suffered the wrath of our European settlers, but also that of his own Asian community, dominated as it was by business interests. And I think there is some important research to be done on this. If you look at history of Kenya, there are a huge number of South Asian people who have been prominent as publishers, as supporting Mau Mau, or even earlier times, doing a lot of positive things as doctors, lawyers, and all sorts of things. And yet they are marginalized partly because, well, one thing was the South Asians were not allowed to own land, I think, but also the South Asian communities did not support their members the way they said. If in Africa